Great. And I do have a couple slides, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. No matter how many times I do this, I feel like I always do it wrong. So do you see my slides?
Yes.
Yay. Okay, cool. So today's topic is, like Rishi said, it's about dissemination, but and I'll be interested to hear maybe from Teresa and Lisa. Maybe they can help me make my point during this presentation, which is that it's important to share your work beyond peer-reviewed publications. Like, that's obviously a very important thing to do, but there are some other ways to kind of get your work out there to disseminate it in an effective way. So that's what we're gonna sort of talk about today. But before I dive in, just a little bit about me. So I work at Academy Health. If you're not familiar with it, we would love to have you join us. We are a professional society that focuses on health services research and health policy research. And so our members are really come from a broad set of disciplines, from health economists to clinicians to patient advocates to public health folks, like all over the map, which makes my job super interesting because I never know what I'm going to be talking about with folks about what type of work they're doing. And just hearing a little bit about Rachel and Teresa's work just further proves my point that I get to work with people who are doing such interesting stuff and really important work. But I am a former journalist. I covered the State House in my home state of Nebraska before making the move out to DC, where I have been doing healthcare communications and advocacy for the past 10 years, I would say, and have been at Academy Health for a large portion of those. Okay, now that's out of the way. What I thought we could talk about today briefly is just like what publication is good for and what it's not so good for, and then what you can do in addition to or in lieu of publication. So we can talk about some direct stakeholder outreach, the production of gray literature, and public speaking and media. So we'll talk through some of those things, and I'm very happy to have you jump in the chat or just call out and interrupt me as we go. It's very informal. Even though I have these slides, I'd like to keep it chill. So I think to start off, the main thing I want to talk about today is that publication is not the only way to disseminate work, and neither is it the best way. And if you're not convinced, I'm going to tell you a few reasons why, and I'm sure I may be preaching to the choir among some of you. But publication is just not enough to move the needle on particularly policy and practice. So while nearly 2 million peer-reviewed articles are published each year, even academics report to only reading about 200 of them. And those are the folks that probably care the most because they're reading their own work and their colleagues' work. So you can imagine for folks like policymakers or even busy healthcare providers that the number would be even lower than that. I also read a sad statistic that there was a study that found that as many as 82% of academic peer-reviewed articles are not cited. So they're just kind of out there on their own, which, part of me is like, that might be a dissemination problem of published work, but it is, as you know, sometimes it's not the most accessible way to share your work because of, the business model of peer-reviewed journals where there might be subscriptions or paywalls, so that folks who don't have a subscription aren't able to, access that work. The other thing that is a problem with published peer-reviewed literature is that it really doesn't make its way into policy and practice. A very often cited study says there's a 17-year lag. So you find something, you're like, this is the way we should be doing things. 17 years later, it makes it into policy and practice. You can imagine between when you found the best way to do something and those 17 years, maybe there had been even more, updates to that policy or practice. So, even if people are reading peer-reviewed work, it still takes a while to get in there, which is obviously too long for decision makers who really need evidence that is responsive and timely. I think the good news is that decision makers do want to hear from academics and they want to hear about studies. In fact, the Congressional Communications Report, which is, I think, released on an annual basis, but they kind of ask congressional staff about valuable information sources, and 39% mentioned the value of academic or issue experts, ranking them as second out of 20 sources. So that's good. That data is a little bit old, so I hope that's still the case. But other people also, other sources of information for policymakers included things like relevant federal agencies, roundtables and briefings. So I think that shows there's a significant level of recognition among, the policymaking audience of the utility of, researchers and their work. But all this said, we know that peer-reviewed publications remain important, even if I've already said all these terrible things about it, because they do achieve these kind of bulleted points that I have here on the slide. So, they're important for credibility. They add to this formal body of knowledge. For a lot of academics, they relate to your job performance and whether or not you're on a tenure track or things like that. They do increase your visibility. So I'm sure we've all seen like a CNN article that's like in a recent study. So when things are sort of blessed by a peer-reviewed journal, it does increase the visibility of the work. Sorry, I see someone is chatting and I just want to.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, please. I was like, I need to have the chat box where I can see it. But yes, absolutely, Lisa. They are not accessible to everyone. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've had to ask a researcher who's like, can you promote this work? And I'm like, well, I can only read the abstract. So I need a little bit more to know, like, what about this work do you want me to promote? Because
it's also
access.
It's also the language, I mean, isn't accessible to everybody.
Absolutely. No, that's so true. Yeah, so when CNN reports on a recent study, it's likely that they haven't just read the study. Hopefully they've talked to the investigator who's kind of broken it down for them, who's used more accessible language to help that reporter translate it for a broader audience. So yeah, there's a lot of translation issues that have to happen to make that work accessible. So I think, even though there's these issues with published work, there are ways that you can increase the value. I mean, you've already worked so hard to get something published that I think once you've published, and this is a depressing slide maybe, but that's when the work begins, which I feel like for a lot of academics and, study partners, it's like, oh my gosh, but I already did all the work, this was such a slog to get to this point. And that is very true. But I couldn't resist having a slide in here urging kind of active dissemination of your published work, which would include, to Lisa's point, some translation of it so that it is accessible to other folks. So I organized this slide from 1 to 4, with 1 being the bare minimum, like tell people when you're published, like at least your network. But then if you can do 2 through 3, that would be great. So working with amplifiers such as, maybe your grant program administrator or your funder, your professional association. At Academy Health, we love to hear when members are published. The journal itself often promotes the work. And so just kind of, being aligned with them is helpful. Your own institution, can all reach kind of people that maybe you personally can't reach. So that's why I call them amplifiers. But then conducting outreach to end users. So when you go to the implications section of your study, who are those implications relevant to? Can you send it directly to them? And to Lisa's point, you probably need to do a little bit of translation depending on who that audience is. So for example, if it's families where your study found something that families need to be doing to improve the health outcomes of their children or whatever it might be, to make sure that when you tell them about it, you use language that makes sense to them, that is free of jargon and that sort of thing. So number 3 it requires it's more than just kind of forwarding the study to someone, right? It's kind of giving them the context and the understanding so that they can immediately know why it matters. Oh, thanks, Charlene. Yeah, the network would be obviously a great amplifier, so definitely keep them in mind. The final thing is about creating supporting materials. So we already talked about the accessibility issue of, peer-reviewed publications. They may be behind a paywall. Could you create a supporting material such as like a study snapshot, which is like a one-pager that sort of includes the most important findings and kind of explains it in a way that is accessible to folks. That's one way you could do that. We're going to talk a little bit more about the value of that sort of those supporting materials. Sometimes they are good even beyond like peer-reviewed stuff. So I'm going to move on from this, but we'll keep talking about ways to kind of disseminate as we go through this. So one of the things that I find with academics and study partners is like they feel like they can't share their findings if they want to get published. They never want to jeopardize their publication chances. And this slide is really to kind of reassure you that journals want something different than other audiences. So there's a way that you can give them sort of your novel research finding that would be interesting to a journal and maybe less so to a policymaker or a patient advocate. They care about things like your multivariate analysis, and you should definitely save that for publication, and other kind of technical findings that would be more appropriate for a journal. But that leaves a lot of other stuff, right? Like just in the study that Rachel was talking about, and the fact that you guys were at that meeting and you were experiencing these other learnings that are not really something you would put in your journal article necessarily, but are still really valuable, right? So I think the first step when you're thinking about how to disseminate beyond a journal is to just sort of assess that treasure trove. And so you can see on this slide, look at all those gems and rubies in there. So whenever I talk to researchers, that's like or anybody who's learning anything, they're like, they have so much to share. And so you will have stuff like background information, things that maybe you weren't directly involved in a study, but you have learned this because of your lived experience or because of whatever you've done in terms of like environmental scans or things like that. You also have things to share around context and trends, so again, drawing on a body of literature that may not be something you were directly involved in, but it's still important. Your work sort of sits within that context. The implications, the recommendations, also research gaps. Like you may have found things, and sometimes that does go into a journal publication, but I think there's still ways that you can share that with very targeted audiences that would actually be able to do something with it as you're, learning and moving through your study. Okay, I'm just looking at my notes to make sure I'm saying everything relevant. But once you have assessed that treasure trove and you thought, this would be a good thing that I would like to share right now beyond a journal to someone other than sort of the academic community. So here's where we get into those 3 other agenda items that I mentioned. So things like direct stakeholder outreach, the production of gray lit. I'm actually not sure why it's called gray literature, but it's basically like stuff that's not peer reviewed. So it could be things like issue briefs or reports, white papers, things like that. And then there's also like public speaking and media opportunities. So it sounds like Rachel and Teresa got to do that recently, sharing some of their work in progress at a conference. So we're going to talk about some best practices around those. And I'd love to hear from your personal experiences, anything that you found to be helpful in these various methods. So let's jump into this direct stakeholder outreach. And I think this will get to, Lisa, what you had brought up, matching your finding to your audience. So like all good communication and dissemination strategies. When you look at your project or your study, you need to match what you highlight and include to the audience, right? So these are some specific examples that a researcher at Washington University in St. Louis shared with me. I'm just going to show you how they the language changes, the finding changes based on who she was sort of, sharing it with. So if your audience is academic, the finding can be detailed and scientific because they will have kind of that foundational knowledge to make sense of that. So for example, our sequential mixed methods design use and I'm probably going to say this wrong, so I'm not an academic audience, so that's the point. Use the CFIR framework to collect data and then analyze it using logistic regression. So if she said that to me, I would be like, okay, I need to Google what some of those words mean. I don't understand why that's impactful. Whereas an academic audience might, based on the context of what she was sharing. Now, for a policymaker, you're definitely going to want to move that up a couple levels and focus on the practical, sort of pragmatic takeaways from it. So in her example, she said, I might say something like, the patterns we found suggest that county level policymakers should consider pooling their resources to monitor COVID hotspots. So that is very direct. It also, I like how she used the language, because another thing I find with researchers sometimes is they're scared to direct someone to do something based on their work. But here she used a softer word like suggest, and she said she was looking at patterns. So it kind of puts it into context for a policymaker about what are they supposed to do based on what she found. And then if we look at a care provider, again, they're similar to a policymaker. They want to know, what should I act on? What does this mean for me in my day-to-day? And again, she used kind of similar language. Our results suggest that doctors should work with their patients to determine the best weight loss approach because that makes everyone happier and more successful. So again, she's kind of focusing on the outcome and what would happen if they did kind of follow what her research had shown. Obviously, these are all different topic areas. So, but she had picked stuff that had implications for specific audiences and then tailored her language around that. So that is when you're doing direct outreach to end users or to other stakeholders, I think, one shoe doesn't fit all. And you really, just like you wouldn't talk to your teenage daughter the same way you would talk to your grandmother about something, right? It's just human nature. And so applying that to how we communicate about our work can make it much more compelling and make it easier for people to sort of act on it, which is the whole point. I think the other thing that I wanted to mention is sometimes you might be doing this in person. So it's not always, or maybe not in person, but via Zoom or something like that. And so being ready to sort of adapt that outreach. So having kind of different ways where you say the same thing. So thinking about if I had 20 whole minutes with a policymaker, here's everything I would tell them. Now, if I only had 5 minutes with them, these are my, my bottom line messages. So thinking about how you can develop your key messages at variable lengths is important. And it's also a great skill to kind of hone your ability to edit yourself, help you be succinct. I think the other thing to mention, and this is just, again, human behavior stuff, but think about how you can quickly develop rapport with someone. And, things like that, rapport and maybe credibility are going to be important things to kind of establish up front. And those can come from many different things, right? So sometimes for some audiences, the letters behind someone's name, that establishes credibility and rapport right away. Whereas for other audiences, that actually might send off some alarm bells, like, oh, what is this academic trying to tell me? And so what are other ways you can establish that connection and rapport? There's shared interests that you have, or, maybe, this is a stupid one maybe, but you both are from the same area, your kids went to the same school or whatever. Those are ways to kind of develop that rapport, to help people kind of be like, establish that trust and be ready to listen. And then the other point here is just how you structure your delivery. So thinking ahead of time about what is it that you want this audience to walk away with and lead with that, right? So lead with your key points, and you may need to repeat them throughout because especially when you're doing kind of verbal communication like that, people can't remember everything you say. So there's going to be points where you want to reiterate what you're saying so that they can follow along. And then, of course, planning for interruptions, distractions, objections, thinking about that ahead of time, especially as, you know, we're all more virtual, we may be working from home, we might be having to drive somewhere while we're talking to someone, or we might, you know, be doing some multitasking with caregiving or whatever else that might be. And just to not let that kind of totally throw you off when you're delivering, you know, information about your work. So that's what I have to say about direct stakeholder outreach. And there's probably a million other things I could say, but I wonder, any questions, reactions to that part about how to talk to people about your work?
I can't remember which grant I applied for recently, but there was one that had like a plain language like summary of it. And that would be like a really cool asset to a journal article, to be able to have to write something in plain language so that like the vast majority of the population could understand.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. I'm so heartened to hear that funders are asking for that. I think sometimes those incentives, just the way the whole academic structure is set up, sometimes there isn't an incentive to, you know, people are so focused on just getting into the any jams or the JAMAs of the world, that stuff kind of falls to the wayside. So that's awesome that funders are starting to require that.
How often do you suggest like having physical pieces of paper or like a summary sheet or something that you give people to have afterward? That's something you
Yeah.
recommend?
Yes, I do actually. And I know it seems kind of old school, but especially with policymakers, and it's just nice because you may not have much time with them, and then they can, well, a lot of times you're talking to their staff, for example, and then their staff can keep that, put it in their briefing book, follow, and especially if you have a place where they can get more information. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some best practices for how to develop those things. But yeah, I think those are always helpful. And even if you don't print them, but you attach them to an email, or, you know, you direct them to a link online, it's just people still appreciate like a physical summary that they can, you know, maybe not even that they need to print out, but that they can reference. Great comments. I see Marie's asking, would these materials be available to share with other trainees? Do you mean these, like the slides, or?
Yeah, yeah. I think they're trained to do the formal lectures in front of everybody with suits and, you know, all that stuff, but they don't know how to take it down a notch to talk to investors or parents or paramedical colleagues or even family members. You know, what is your research on, daughter? They have no clue how to convey it. And you don't really understand something unless you can take it down to a very fundamental level. And that, I think, is a really hard skill set to be able to do in a nimble fashion. But if you practice it enough and know that you're supposed to do it, with the guide, you know, I took screenshots. I hope you don't mind. But
no, of course,
you know,
happy to share. I'll share my slides,
you know,
sure.
just being able to know that, okay, I'm talking to, you know, trainees, or I'm talking to angel investors, or I'm talking to a parent support group. That's the mark of a good teacher, is to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great point. And I think it's so true that, again, the incentives aren't always there for folks who are in the midst of their PhD,
Right.
or, you know, whatever it might be, to kind of step back. But if they really want to see, their work make an impact, they have to learn those skills, right? And like you said, I think a lot of it comes with practice.
Yep.
And I see that Lisa has put something in the chat about making research articles accessible.
Yeah, it's just an example. I used to be the chair of the USED advisory here in Vermont, and not surprisingly, even back then I was pushing this. And so they had done a few pieces where they had translated some of their research articles into accessible formats. So
Right.
just as an FYI, I put an example, a link.
I love it. Thank you. I love to collect those because I think it helps people to actually see something. Again,
Mhm.
knowing my audience, because they may think that they've done something that like explains everything. And then you show them like, well, this is more what I'm talking about. And that could be really
Mhm.
helpful.
Yeah.
So let's talk a
I
little
was
bit.
gonna
Go ahead,
I was
Lindsay.
just going to add, based on Marie's sentiment, it sounds like very similar, like to family-centered rounds. Like we as pediatricians have practiced doing that, but I think that you're right. There's like a need to figure out how to tailor that type of communication to a lot of different audiences.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We've been doing bedside rounds with family members at my institution. I don't know, almost forever. I mean, I was doing it as a fellow even, which obviously was a long time ago, and being able to communicate pretty complicated information in a non-threatening, non-frightening, and non-condescending way, that's tough if you don't do it a lot.
For sure. It's definitely a skill.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit. Oh, sorry, Charlene, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to put in a plug too for Academy Health, because I've been a member for a long time, and Academy Health is one of the very few places that has this kind of information available in a more formal way. Lauren and her colleagues do I think it's an annual presentation / class, if you will. But to me, this is so important because, over the course of your research careers, you're going to, some of the studies you do will be a little bit humdrum, but you're also going to do stuff that is super important that really needs to get out in the New York Times or to a legislator or whatever. And, it is just so worth it for yourself and your colleagues to go through this training. Because in working with the PIs that we work with who have not really taken this seriously or not spent much time thinking about dissemination, it's really difficult to kind of move them in that direction. And so I would just put in a plug for Lauren and her colleagues and the amazing training that they do at Academy Health. So, and she paid me millions of dollars to say that. No, just kidding.
Oh, Charlene, that's amazing. Yes, and we want to be doing more of that at Academy Health because we know that it's a gap in the field. Like you were saying, Marie, people don't get that training as a part of their, formal academic training. So unfortunately, our 2023 offering is sold out. But I'm going to put the link in the chat so you guys can look at it. It's basically a 3-week online course that kind of talks you through and uses practicing. We have templates, things like that you can practice this skill. So I'll put that in there. And then, we want to offer more of that kind of stuff. So always open to ideas about needs you see in the field. Just literally, you can just email me. So I'm mindful of the time. I just want to say a few more things about gray literature and then whatever the last thing is, supporting resources, I think. But to just describe gray literature, it takes many forms and it kind of creates this anchor that you can direct people to. So to your question, Rachel, about having something that you print off, that's great. It's also okay to have that kind of anchor online, like a blog post or an issue brief. We talked a little bit about study snapshots or leave behinds, which is exactly what you were saying, Rachel, like when you have a piece of paper that you literally leave behind after you've met with someone, so that they can refer to it later. So I'm going to talk about each of these. So blog posts, can be very high level and trend focused. So they're not going to get you in trouble with your journal because they're going to be really different than the type of information that you would have in a peer reviewed journal. So in fact, you would invert the abstract. So getting to Marie's point about how academicians are sort of trained to write about their work, they start out with like, here's the topic that I was thinking about. This is what I thought would happen. Here's how I investigated my methods. This is what I found, and this is what it means at the very bottom. And a blog post, and most times when you're communicating with direct stakeholders, it needs to be flipped. This is what it means. These are the implications that come first. And then you can, delve into, if there was something cool about how you did it and things like that. But blog posts would typically avoid sort of those scientific details. And it really puts your work in context from background and trends and things like that. And I think for some folks, maybe they think like, well, people already know that, but they don't. They don't know the background and trends that you know. They don't have the experiences that you have. So that is still really valuable. Even if, it's not going to be published in any JM, it's still really important to share. Now, issue briefs, you might feel like you need a little bit more room. So blog posts are typically, I think the longest blog post that I would recommend would be like 2,000 words. That's what the Health Affairs blog limits you to. But issue briefs can be a lot longer. There can be, multiple pages. It's still pretty high level, but there's room for more details. The key points, as you see on this screenshot, are offered up front. So you see them like there on the front page, similar to, I think Lisa's example follows some of these best practices. So a lot of times there'll be charts and tables, visuals to help kind of people who are skimming kind of get the key messages as they look through it. And then this was a study snapshot that I talked about. So they're basically like a public facing abstract is how I put it to researchers. So it says what your question was, but most of the meat, the real estate, is on your key findings and the implications. So you'll see in this one, it talks about what they looked at. There's 2 paragraphs on kind of the findings, and then there's like the implications. This is cut off, it would be longer. There's like 1 key implication, and then it kind of gives a little more color in the next, and it's just 1 page. So really easy to share that with folks. And then once you have that anchor, you can repurpose it to share in different ways. So let's say you have a report or an issue brief where you have graphics in there. You can then take that little graphic out, use it on as a Twitter post, for example, or put it in your PowerPoint. So just a point to make that, sometimes I think people are like, oh my gosh, I'm working on a peer-reviewed article, and now you want me to do this like white paper, and then I'm supposed to share it on Twitter and do a PowerPoint about it. And I'm just trying to make the point that some of this stuff can be sort of thought ahead about when you're making these things, that think about how could I use this in different ways so that you're not starting from scratch. The last thing I was going to talk about was public speaking and media. I'll blaze through this. Develop a story arc for presentation. So I think sometimes that can be hard. It's like what Marie was saying when people are like, well, what is your research about? And you're like on the spot. How can you create kind of a story arc that has just 1 to 3 messages? Because we know that when people hear information verbally, they only retain like 60% of it or something like that. So you want to get people's attention up front, develop that after you've kind of hooked them, and then have a strong close at the end, ideally with, if it's appropriate, some kind of call to action, right? Even if the call to action is sign up for our newsletter or come to a meeting with us or visit our website, those kinds of things are helpful to have at the end. I'm sure Rachel and Teresa will be familiar with this, knowing the format and the setup. So, what's the difference between a poster presentation and a roundtable and a, whatever it might be, a panel, and making sure you know that in advance and have thought about how your messages will fit into that format. This last one is like to me very obvious, but talk to your audience. So like look at them. And your slides are for them. They are not a script for you, right? So everything you create is for that audience. So going back to the importance of kind of knowing your audience and where they're coming from, that translates into presentations as well. So I know Charlene talked about, some of your work should be in the New York Times. Here are a few things to think about when you're working with media. The first one is like, tell them. So reach out when you have news. And I know it feels weird and you're like, oh gosh, are they really going to care? But anything you have, and when I talk about news, that can mean a lot of different things. So what do I mean by news? Something that's new, something that's unique, the first or the only, something that's timely. So if the public conversation is talking about, I don't know, there was a lot of like opportunity when the pandemic hit and there was so many news articles about our public health system. And there were some timely moments when I feel like researchers could reach out and be like, hey, now that you guys are talking about this, I actually do have something to share around that. Also local. So local stories, maybe, and I think local news is also really important. I started my career as a local newspaper reporter in a small county in Nebraska. And I myself was surprised at how important the local newspaper was to that community and how much kind of sway it had over the public conversation. Get the background info before you schedule the interview, like what is the story about? Who else is the reporter talking to? What are they looking to you to provide? You can ask all these questions ahead of time. That's totally normal. Be honest but if you don't know something, you can say, I don't know, that's fine. And, happy to follow back up with more detail. Just be professional and prepared, meaning like, think about if it's a Zoom interview, you want to kind of think about where you're taking it from and making sure there's no distractions, things like that. Try your best to be memorable and use sound bites. So that's where that kind of key messaging comes through again. Like think in your head at the end of this interview, what would I love to see as the headline or as the quote? And then just work that into your messaging as you're, speaking with the reporter. And this part sounds awkward, but it does help to practice beforehand. So to do that with a colleague or with a family member or with yourself in the mirror, just to kind of get yourself used to the answers that you're going to give and how you're going to deliver them. So those are my do's. My don'ts are don't keep talking to fill the silence. That can get you into trouble because you'll start talking about stuff that maybe you're not as confident on or that doesn't relate to what your current study. Don't speculate. Again, it's fine to say, hey, I actually don't know about that question in the context that I studied it. I would need to look into the body of literature, or I could direct you to someone who could speak to that. That's always fine to say. And that reporters love having another source to follow up on. That's a good thing. Don't be late for a deadline. I mean, that's like what leads people's lives is like they are on deadline. If you don't get back to them, then you snooze, you lose. And I think even letting them know like, hey, I can't do this, but think of me next time, or here's somebody else, or you could read my article, which is here, check out this blog post. If you can't do the interview, they appreciate that too. Don't forget your key messages. So I think writing that down ahead of time, kind of centering yourself on what is, because it's a conversation with a purpose, right? It goes both ways. The media person has their purpose of like getting information. You have yours, and that's okay, to get your work out in a clear and compelling way. And then the final thing is don't give too much detail up front. It's always good if they're asking you for more later, you can, provide that. But I think if you give too much, it can be overwhelming. The reporter can get confused. Remember, they're probably not a scientist or may not have healthcare experience even, especially in today's newsrooms. Reporters are covering all kinds of different topic areas. So just making it easy for them so they have the most important stuff. And then you can say, I have more detail on all of this. So, let me know if you want to know more. Oh my gosh, I feel like I just really talked a lot and very fast through that last bit, but that's all I have for you today. I know we have, I think maybe 5 minutes left, and I don't know if there's other business you guys need to talk about, but happy to respond to any questions or, reflections.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like how helpful it is to just go over what are the different areas that you can talk about your research in outside of just conferences and publications. I think just hearing all of those opportunities and what is important on each of those is really valuable. So thank you.
Oh, of course, my pleasure. And there's many more we could talk about, I'm sure. Teresa, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I just I don't know. It just was really interesting to hear that and like have like an inventive brain that's like, ooh, they should create this or this. But it'd be really cool if there was something where you can like look up like peer-reviewed, like good research, and there's like some sort of free link to like, here it is in plain language for a caregiver or something like that, you know, so that it's like, because most like I do spend a lot of time looking up, and I have in the past. Like when my daughter was little, I would constantly try to look things up because her issues were complex and nobody knew what to do. So I was trying to find anything I could, but then, yeah, well, and the internet, it was 2002. So like there wasn't as much then there, but even now when I'm looking for things, whether it's for personal use or for school, most of the time what I find like, oh, I can't read the whole thing. And then, you know, because it costs, plus it's like, I don't know, hard to understand a lot of the times. And so it would be really awesome if there was some way to have things explained in plain language and super important. So I loved that. And yeah, just a lot of different thoughts. I have like a specific like interest in like eating disorders and eating disorder recovery. And I always thought like how amazing it would be to take the experience that I know from certain things and be able to present that to like doctors with another doctor. And so like a doctor who's saying like, here's the clinical part and like, here's the other part, you know, that's like from perspective, you know, how amazing something like that would be. And so I just think like that collaboration and making sure that like the language is there for everybody and just the different perspectives. I don't know. I just thought that it was all really interesting. So
yeah, that's so valuable. And what I love about this network is that it's kind of built in because, you know, you have someone like Rachel and someone like Teresa who are working together, and like you guys bring different perspectives and you're able to kind of be like, oh, that makes sense for this audience, but not for this one. And I think, you know, our CEO at Academy Health has this phrase that she always says, like, your data makes you credible, but your stories make you memorable. Mm-hmm. And so like having that combination that you were talking about, Teresa, where it's like, you know, somebody who's really an expert in the clinical side, but then someone who's an expert in the lived experience or the, you know, to humanize it, because I just think that's the stuff that people remember, you know, it's even at academic conferences, like the best sessions are the ones where it's like, oh, this person actually shared something real world that wasn't just like theoretical, or from even when doctors share patient stories, like that's so powerful. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I've been reviewing federal grants for a number of years, and there's a very distinct shift in focus on engagement of, you know, the euphemism stakeholders, which is families. And I was just reviewing a couple of grants for the opioid catastrophe focused research that's being funded through something called the HEAL Initiative. And those were very, very, very specifically identifying the need to engage the families and the patients in the projects they were developing in order to, you know, if nobody will do it and nobody will believe it, why waste the time and the money? So that is a distinct shift in the last 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, and just like, I think it was
Mhm.
Lindsay that shared about how the funders are now requiring or asking for those plain language summaries and things like
Yep.
that. So
Yep.
things are changing slowly,
Yep.
but I think the more we can focus folks on that real world impact, the more they have to change, because
Yeah.
the old ways just don't work.
Yeah.
Anyway, Rishi, I think we're at time, so I'll pass it back to you.
Yes, great. Well, that was a great point to end on. And, Lauren, thank you so much for, giving both the
Superb.
rationale and just the practical aspects of this. I think this was just really fantastic. And, thanks everybody for your engagement. And yes, have a great day, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Well,